My talk today is called September 11th, Should the Truth Be Revealed or Concealed? Now you might think it's obvious. Of course the truth should be revealed. But that depends upon what the truth is and who you are. Members of the elite of our societies may not think the truth should be revealed, given what the truth is. Well, I will come to that question at the end of my lecture. First, I must discuss what is the truth. Now, if by that you mean the details of what happened on 9/11 and leading up to it, we don't know. That's why we need a genuine investigation that would issue subpoenas and put people under lie detectors and threaten people with jail time if they don't tell the truth and expose the higher-ups who perpetrated this. None of this has been done. It was the crime of the century. It was the greatest crime in American history, and yet it was not investigated like a local bank robbery was investigated. There has been no genuine investigation asking who really did it. So we don't know that. But there is one very big truth that anyone with at least a 30% open mind can know already, which is that the official story is false. We can put this in terms of conspiracy theories. At least in America, we have an almost Pavlovian response. If someone says conspiracy, we say, oh, I don't believe in conspiracy theories. But of course, we all believe in conspiracy theories. A conspiracy is simply when 2 or 3 people conspire in secret to do something illegal. Our newspapers are full of stories about conspiracies every day. People conspire to rob banks. Corporations conspire to defraud their customers, and so on. We are all conspiracy theorists. So we would be much more honest if we, with Michael Moore, would simply say, now, I'm not into conspiracy theories except the ones that are true. Nevertheless, journalists continue to use this phrase to discourage us, to disparage us in the 9/11 Truth movement as conspiracy theorists, and seem to imply that just to call us conspiracy theorists is to show that we're loopy. The term was used by President Bush right after 9/11. He said, don't tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories about the attacks of 11 September. But what could he mean by that? He couldn't mean we should reject all conspiracy theories about September 11th, because the official theory about September 11th is a conspiracy theory, according to which Osama bin Laden conspired with 19 Arab Muslims to hijack airliners and crash them into buildings. So he only meant beware of outrageous conspiracy theories. Well, what would an outrageous theory be? We can approach that by asking in terms of the philosophy of science. You have competing theories, and you have criteria to decide between a good theory and a bad theory. A good theory is one that agrees with all the facts. A bad theory is one that's contradicted by some of the relevant facts. An outrageous theory would be one that is contradicted by all the relevant facts. And that's what the official theory is. So you in this country may not think of George W. Bush as a particularly subtle man, but actually he was saying very subtly here, you should reject the official theory because it is the outrageous conspiracy theory. But of course, no American journalists understood the subtlety. Now, why is the official theory an outrageous conspiracy theory? Because every one of the major elements in it can easily be shown to be false. Let's go through these. First, the attacks were ordered by Osama bin Laden. Second, the attacks were carried out by 19 Arab Muslim members of Al-Qaeda under the leadership of Mohammed Atta. This team of Al-Qaeda terrorists managed to hijack 4 airliners and crash them into buildings in spite of a system between the FAA, the Federal Aviation Authority, and the U.S. military designed to stop such events. Fourth, these clever terrorists, by crashing into 2 buildings of the World Trade Center, were able to cause 3 of them to suffer total collapse. 5, they were also able to crash an airliner into the Pentagon. 6, we can be sure that the attack was orchestrated by Al-Qaeda because it was the only organization with the motive and the means to carry out such an attack. And 7, we can believe all this because it has been fully verified by the 9/11 Commission, which was a fully independent, impartial commission. So we'll take these one by one. Ordered by Osama bin Laden. This claim, of course, was used to justify the attack on Afghanistan, where bin Laden had been, and the resulting more general war on terror aimed at Arab and Muslim countries. But no proof was ever presented that Osama bin Laden was involved. Colin Powell promised a white paper that would provide that proof. He never did. Tony Blair volunteered to provide such a paper, provided one, but then he said, "This does not purport to provide a prosecutable case against Osama bin Laden in a court of law." So, good enough to go to war, not good enough to go to court. The Taliban said to Bush, "You show us the evidence that Osama was involved and we'll gladly hand him over." We refused. Now, 2 months later, Bush administration said, well, we didn't have to provide any proof because luckily we found a video in which Osama took credit for the attacks. Of course, he had earlier said he was not involved in the attacks. But this video, which you can find by going under Google, look under fake bin Laden video, and you will find it. And you will see that the man in this video is much darker, much heavier, has a broader nose than the real Osama bin Laden. The only thing they have in common is they both have a beard. In July of 2001, an event happened that suggests that Osama was still working for the CIA, as he had been, of course, in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union. Because a very respected journalist reported that Osama was in the American hospital in Dubai being treated by an American doctor, and that while he was there, he was visited by the local CIA agent. Finally, it's not just the members of our movement who say there's no evidence that Osama was involved. How about our own FBI? Go on the FBI's most wanted pages. Look under Osama bin Laden. You will find he's wanted for various terrorist attacks, but there is no mention of 9/11. Ed Haas, who has a website called Muckraker Report, the Muckraker Report, called up the FBI to ask why isn't Osama wanted for 9/11. And Rex Toome, the chief of investigative publicity for the FBI, said the reason why 9/11 is not mentioned on Osama bin Laden's most wanted page is because the FBI has no hard evidence that connecting bin Laden to 9/11. So much for the first point. Let's go to the second one. The attacks were carried out by 19 Arab Muslims. One element in this story is that these men were very devout, and so of course they were ready to meet their Maker, and so going on a suicide mission would be no problem for them. The 9/11 Commission report said Muhammad Atta had become very religious, even fanatically so. But Daniel Hopsicker, a well-known investigative journalist, wrote a book pointing out that Atta loved cocaine, alcohol, gambling, pork, and lap dances. The Wall Street Journal reported that many of the other alleged terrorists had similar tastes, which they often indulged in Las Vegas. The 9/11 Commission, reporting a particular time in which the men met in Las Vegas, said, "We have found no credible evidence explaining why, on this occasion and others, the operatives flew to or met in Las Vegas." Evidently, the members of the commission don't read left-wing rags like the Wall Street Journal. Another problem with this story, these men allegedly bought tickets just like everybody else and got on the plane in a normal way. So their names would be on the flight manifests. But the flight manifests that have been released by American Airlines and United Airlines don't have their names on them. They don't have any Arab names on them. You say, well, we've seen videos of them at the airport. Well, you've seen a video of Muhammad Atta in Portland, Maine, but not in Boston. You say, well, we saw this one in Washington, Dulles. Well, you've seen a video frame of this gentleman, but there is video cameras, security cameras, always have the time on the screen and the location. There is no indication on this video. It does not look like a security camera video frame. Well, you say Atta was going to get on the plane and got there late, and his bags got left, and it had all this incriminating evidence in it. You know, flight manuals, stuff about the Boeings, and instructions to the other hijackers, and all that. So, isn't that proof? This bag also had Muhammad Atta's will. If you were going to fly a plane into the World Trade Center, would you take your will on the flight? No. These classic cases, obvious cases of planted evidence. This is what you do with false flag operations. You've got an enemy you want to attack. You carry out an attack against yourself and you plant evidence to blame the enemy, and then you go to war. The Japanese did this when they wanted to attack Manchuria. They blew up their own railroad and blamed the Chinese and proceeded to slaughter several million Chinese in Manchuria. The Germans did it, of course, you all know this, when they were ready to attack Poland. They sent Germans out in Polish uniforms to come across the border and attack themselves. And then they leave they kill a few convicts and put them in Polish uniforms and leave them at the scene. And that was Hitler's proof. So that the attack on Poland was a defensive war. Okay, now also you say, well, we know from the cell phones, the phone calls from the planes, that there were Arabs on there with bandanas on and box cutters and knives and maybe bombs and so on. Well, a lot of these calls were allegedly made on cell phones, on mobile phones. But the technology to make phone calls from high in the air had not been developed. It was only developed in 2004, and only this year, 2006, is now being made available. At that time, you could reliably make cell phone calls, mobile phone calls, under 600 meters. Between 600 meters and 2,400 meters. You might do it if you were lucky, but it would probably go in and out, and you probably couldn't do it at all. Above 2,400 meters, it was essentially impossible. And yet, Flight 93, which was you can call the cell phone flight, that's the one, and you've seen United 93, the movie, you see all these people making all these crystal clear phone calls. Well, they were over 9,000 meters, 30,000 feet. So it would have been completely impossible in those days. So this is more fabricated evidence. See, and these things can be done by voice morphing. They did have the technology for voice morphing. So William Arkin reported this in 1999 in the Washington Post. And he saw a demonstration, and he heard the voice of Colin Powell saying, I am being treated well by my captors. He heard the voice of another well-known American general saying, Gentlemen, we have called you together to inform you that we are going to overthrow the United States government. Everybody in the room would have sworn that that was the voice of that general if they hadn't known better. They can also do real-time voice morphing. So you speak into the device that you've created for a particular person, and in real time it will sound like the voice of that person at the other end. So that seems to be what happened on those cell phone flights on Flight 93, because there are a few of them in which there was a little genuine interaction. But one of them really gives the case away. Mark Bingham's mother was called, and the voice at the end said, Mom, this is Mark Bingham. Now, I don't know your customs in Denmark, but in America, none of us ever call our mothers and identify ourselves by using our last names, no matter how stressful the situation we're in. Okay, now this week a new fake bin Laden video has appeared, which I haven't seen it yet, but I've told it shows bin Laden talking to some of the alleged hijackers. You've seen the movie Forrest Gump. They can do video morphing too. So you saw Forrest Gump being played by Tom Hanks, shaking hands with President John F. Kennedy, played by John F. Kennedy. So when you see this new video, think Forrest Gump. Another problem with this story is that some of the alleged hijackers were reported shortly after 9/11 to still be alive, reported by generally reliable news organizations such as the BBC and some London newspapers. One of these was Walid al-Shiri. The 9/11 Commission simply ignored that report. That was one reported by the BBC. 9/11 Commission, maybe they could refute it. Maybe they say mistaken identity or something. No, they just ignore it and went ahead to speculate that Walid al-Shiri was the one who stabbed a flight attendant shortly before Flight 11 hit the World Trade Center. But of course, 3 years earlier, shortly after 9/11, he had called a press conference in Morocco and said, I'm a pilot. I'm still very much alive. So this is the quality of the 9/11 Commission. And as was mentioned, I've written a whole book on this called The 9/11 Commission Report, Omissions and Distortions. And I identified at least 115 lies of omission and distortion in there. And some of them are really enormous lies, extremely obvious. And until just this week in the United States, a story came out in the Washington Post by Michael Powell, who is the New York bureau chief of the Washington Post. And he reported some of these enormous contradictions in the commission report for the first time. So there are signs that things may be changing. But who knows, after the week of 9/11 is all over, maybe we'll go back to the way it was before. But at least that information is out there, and journalists here can refer to that and cite that. I'll refer to that particular example a little later. Okay, third claim. 4 teams of Muslim Arab hijackers outwitted the world's most sophisticated defense system. Standard operating procedures. When the FAA sees any sign that a plane is in trouble, they've lost the transponder signal, they've lost radio contact, or the plane has gone significantly off course and they're not able to pull it back within a minute. The FAA then notifies the U.S. military, and then it calls the nearest Air Force base that has fighters on alert. They scramble planes, and generally this whole operation takes 10 minutes. And 2 fighters will be on the tail of the plane, and there are standard signals then to deal with it. Normally I say within 10 minutes, yet on that day that did not happen. Why not? Well, we've been given 3 different stories what the military did. The first story was that we didn't send up any planes until after the Pentagon was struck. And that would have meant about 90 minutes after the first sign that a plane was in trouble, maybe hijacked. This story was told by General Richard Myers, who was the acting chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff on 9/11. It was also told by Mike Snyder, who was a spokesman for NORAD. So they surely knew what they were talking about. And yet, within a couple days, people started saying, that doesn't sound very good. That sounds like a stand down. 90 minutes? You generally intercept in 10 minutes. What happened? So they came up with a second story. And according to the second story, yeah, we sent planes up, but we couldn't get there on time because the FAA had been so late notifying us that we tried, but in each case, we got there late. Well, early members of the 9/11 movement did the math. And they said, well, look, even if the FAA was as late as you say, which is hard to believe, and nobody from the FAA was fired, and they would be 20 minutes late, 30 minutes late notifying, but that's fine. Even if that were true, you still had time to get there. You certainly could have intercepted the second airliner, the second one that hit the World Trade Center, and certainly the one that hit the Pentagon. We're talking 40 minutes there. So why didn't you? Looks like a stand down, or at least a slow down order. So that was when I came into the movement, and when I wrote The New Pearl Harbor, that's the story I told, and that's the problem I pointed out. That book came out in the fall, the very end of 2003, almost right at the beginning of 2004. And of course, at that time, the 9/11 Commission was going on, and it didn't complete its work until July of 2004. Well, when that study came out, they have a brand new story. The new story is, no, that wasn't true, and it's unfortunate that story was told because it made it look like the military did have time to intercept. They admitted that those guys who did the math were right. There was time to intercept if that story was true, but they said, no, that wasn't true. Yeah, there was some notification of the first flight, Flight 11, but the second flight, the one that hit the South Tower, the military didn't know about that it was hijacked until after it hit the tower. And the Flight 77, the one that allegedly hit the Pentagon, you were not notified at 9:24, the way you said. No, you didn't know about that until after the Pentagon was struck. And certainly Flight 93, about which there's been considerable speculation based on considerable evidence that the military shot it down, you didn't know about that flight either. So you couldn't have scrambled planes, and that's the new story. Now, most people didn't read the 9/11 Commission report. It's like the Bible, highly praised and seldom read. So everybody assumes the 9/11 report is definitive, but very few people had read it. So hardly anybody knew this new story. So just a few weeks ago, a story came out in Vanity Fair called 9/11 Live, the NORAD Tapes. And it emphasized that these tapes that NORAD had developed, had all along, my point is they were fabricated later, that they disprove the second story and prove this new story. And that's why the 9/11 Commission is telling the new story. It's based on the tapes. So when you read the Danish translation of the New Pearl Harbor, you won't know that. So to learn this, you have to actually get my next book. Now, what are the problems in this new story? Well, first of all, they portray the FAA, the Federal Aviation Authority, as just enormously incompetent that day, from top to bottom. Now, the FAA, to work for the FAA, you have to pass very rigorous tests. You have to be a very competent person who can react well under pressure. And there are all the signs that that's the truth, because the FAA orders scrambles over 100 times a year. The year prior to 9/11, there were 129. So this is something they do about 2 or 3 times a week, and it evidently goes flawlessly. And yet that day, nobody could do anything right. Not the controllers at Boston or Indianapolis. And when they finally called to Herndon, then people there would sit on it. And finally, somebody might call Washington FAA headquarters. And they would sit around debating. They say, well, okay, that plane, 2 planes have already hit the World Trade Center. This plane has a bomb on it. Should we call the military? Oh, gee, I don't know. I mean, it's just beyond belief. It's cartoon stuff. And actually, they have made a cartoon version now of the 9/11 Commission report, and that's highly appropriate, because some of that dialogue is just comic stuff, and yet it's been believed. At least half of the Americans are still in this trance of 9/11, and most of our journalists are still in this trance of 9/11. Or else their corporate owners tell them they can't say otherwise. Who knows what the real story is? But up until just the last few weeks, they've not revealed any of the problems in the story. Anyway, that's one problem with the news story. Another problem is that it is the third story the military has told. And normally, if you have a suspect in a crime and he keeps changing his story, you start getting suspicious. So let's take... I'll use an American name. Let's say Charlie Smith robbed, they suspect that Charlie robbed this bank on Saturday night in this little town. And so the police come to him and say, Charlie, where were you Saturday night? Charlie says, I was at the movies. No, Charlie, movie theater's been closed all week. Oh, yeah, that's right, Saturday night, that's when I was with my girlfriend. No, Charlie, we checked with her, and she was home with her husband. And so Charlie says, oh, yeah, that's right. I was home reading my Bible. You're probably not going to believe it. And yet, that's exactly the situation we have with the military. They tell the one story, say, that doesn't sound right. Oh, no, that's right. We did tried to intercept, but we were late. No, you could have gotten there on time. And, oh, that's right. We weren't even told about the flights. So, yeah, applaud once in a while. It gives me a chance to get a drink of water. A third problem with this news story is that it contradicts the second story. So let's take Flight 77. According to the second story, the military was notified at 9:24 that morning, and they scrambled airplanes, fighters from Langley Air Force Base at 9:30. That was on the September 18th, 2001 is when NORAD, the section of the military that protects North American airspace, put out this timeline. And then when its leading generals came to testify to the 9/11 Commission in 2003, when the commission first got started, they told that story again. And they said, yes, we were notified at 9:24, and then we scrambled planes at 9:30 in response to knowing about Flight 77. Well, as I say, the news story, according to the NORAD tapes, is that they were not notified about Flight 77, and that really they scrambled the flights. They can't deny the flights were scrambled. Everybody knows the flights were scrambled at 9:30 from Langley. So they couldn't deny that. So they said, you scrambled them to go after Phantom Flight 11. So the news story is that the controller in Boston, after the Flight 11 hit the World Trade Center, this controller got confused and said, oh no, Flight 11 didn't hit the World Trade Center. It's still up and it's heading towards Washington. And so you, military, General Arnold, what you really did is you scrambled those fighters to go after Phantom Flight 11, a flight that didn't exist, a ghost flight. And why didn't you tell us that in 2003? And Arnold says, oh, I didn't remember. Can you imagine this? This would have been the most embarrassing moment in his life, that the one time he finally scrambled fighters on 9/11 was to go after a non-existent plane. He would have been so angry with the FAA because they sent him on this wild goose chase after a non-existent plane. And, all these people were killed and he forgot. It's beyond belief, this news story. Now, what does the 9/11 Commission do? Explain why did General Arnold tell a false story? Not only General Arnold, other people, and in fact the whole military, because everybody would have known if that story was false, that it was false. So everybody in the Pentagon was going along with this story. Everybody in the Bush administration was. So this is an enormous lie with lots of people participating in the lie, if it was a lie. And so in my 9/11 Commission report book, I asked the question. I said, all the Commission said was Arnold's statement was incorrect. But that means he either had to be confused just a few days after 9/11, or he was lying. Well, it's hard to believe he could have been confused just a few days after 9/11, so he must have been lying. But they didn't raise that question. But now more recently they have. So in that article in the Vanity Fair, that they use this Michael Bronner to tell this new story. Michael Bronner, incidentally, was one of the producers for United 93. They say, well, he had to be lying because he listened to the tapes, the NORAD tapes in 2003, just before he gave the testimony. So if he had forgotten about Phantom Flight 11 and forgotten about they weren't notified about Flight 77, that would have jogged his memory. And yet he came in and still told the old story. And now Chairman Thomas Kean and Vice Chairman Lee Hamilton have written a book that's just come out last week called Without Precedent. And they say this in there, that they're very upset with the military and they suspect the military lied. Now, can we believe the military would have told the lie? We can believe the military would lie, but can we believe the military would tell the particular lie they're accused of telling? Because here's what it is. The old story, remember story number 2, put half of the blame on the FAA. They were late notifying, but half of the blame on the military because the military still had time to get there and they didn't do it. The news story puts all the blame on the FAA. They didn't notify the military at all. So now the military is blameless, according to the news story. Now, if the news story were true, can you imagine that the military would have lied to tell the old story that would make them look bad? Not just bad, it made them look like they were guilty of treason against the United States and mass murder. Would these guys have told a lie like that to protect the poor little FAA? It just doesn't fit with any human psychology, and certainly not human military psychology, that they would have told such a lie. And yet, this is a news story, and the press is buying it. The New York Times had a very long editorial in which they summarized this new case as told in the Vanity Fair article, and just they, as we say, swallowed it hook, line, and sinker. Okay. There are lots of other problems, lots of other facts, and you can read those in my book if you like, that show the news story. It just is impossible. So the third point does not stand up, rather than saying these Arab Muslims out-tricked the U.S. Air Force. It looks like there was a deliberate stand-down to allow the planes to get through. Fourth, these Arab Muslims, by crashing planes into 2 buildings of the World Trade Center, were able to cause the total collapse of 3 of them. This amounts to the claim that these Arabs were so bright, so clever, that besides defeating the world's most sophisticated defense system, they were also able to defeat many of the basic laws of physics. And here we're just talking about high school physics, Newtonian physics, very simple stuff that all of us have some understanding of. So this collapse of the buildings was extremely important. You know, this image of the planes hitting the buildings that we've all seen, at least in America, we've seen hundreds of times, and then the buildings coming down. This implanted this sense in us that we were vulnerable, that we were attacked by Arab Muslims, and caused many people to want revenge. But why did the planes collapse? Why did the buildings collapse? The official story is the impact of the planes plus the fires. That deals with the Twin Towers. But the planes, the crash would have been insignificant. These buildings were very tall, 110 stories. They knew it was possible a giant airliner might crash into them. They were built with that in mind. And many experts who accept the official story say, well, the planes had nothing to do with it other than bringing the jet fuel that got the fire started. But the impact of the airplanes would have been insignificant. And we can discount the impact of the airplanes because Building 7, 47-story building that collapsed later that afternoon, was not hit by an airplane. So you didn't need an airplane. Something else brought the buildings down without the help of the airplanes. So it must have all been the fires. So we've got a fire theory about what brought the World Trade Center buildings down. Now, early on, they told us, there were TV specials that assured us the fires melted the steel. Well, that's ridiculous from the point of view of physics. That a hydrocarbon fire, and people talk about jet fuel as if it's some magic thing. It's basically kerosene. So we're talking about an ordinary hydrocarbon fire, like something you would have in your fireplace. Something you would be having on your stove when you're cooking with a steel pot. Do you worry that the pot is going to melt? Ordinary hydrocarbon fires do not melt steel. Steel does not begin to melt until 1,535 degrees Celsius. Hydrocarbon fire at the very best could get up to 925 degrees Celsius. And the fires that day were nowhere near that. They were burning black. That means they weren't getting oxygen. So they were several hundred degrees lower than that. So the idea that they were melted, that the steel turned into licorice, would be a violation of very basic rules of physics. So some say now, of course they weren't melted, but they got hot enough that they lost 80% of their strength. But that would require fires of 700 degrees Celsius. And again, the evidence is that the fires could not have been nearly that hot. The evidence that NIST, which is NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, has now done the official report. And they themselves admitted that they could only find steel that had gotten up to 250 degrees Celsius. So you're a long way from 700 degrees. Furthermore, even if it had gotten up to those temperatures, that would be irrelevant. We have had fires much bigger, much longer lasting. And by the way, longer lasting is a crucial thing because steel is an excellent conductor of heat. If you have a steel bar and you take a cigarette lighter and heat it up here, you can gradually get it, but It's not going to just heat up that end. It'll go clear through the steel. And then if the bar is connected to another piece of steel, it will go there. In the Twin Towers, 110 stories, you had almost 300 steel columns. Then you had all those horizontal beams on each floor, a massive amount of steel. It would have taken a huge fire, many, many hours, like maybe 20 hours, to even begin to heat up some of the steel to a temperature where it would lose any of its strength, let alone 80%. And we can look at some historical examples. In 1991 in Philadelphia, there was a fire that was a raging fire, burned out many floors, much hotter fire. It was able to break windows. The fires in the World Trade Center, they were not hot enough to break windows. And the fire in Philadelphia burned for 18 hours, did not cause a collapse. A fire in Caracas, more recently, burned for 17 hours. Very hot fire, did not cause any collapse. How long did the South Tower burn before it collapsed? 56 minutes. So we're talking about fires that burned 18 times longer than the fire in the South Tower, and yet we're told that fire caused the South Tower to collapse. It's ridiculous from a physics point of view, from a historical point of view. Furthermore, from a historical point of view, no steel frame high-rise building in history has ever been caused to collapse by fire or fire and externally caused damage. And yet on 9/11 in New York City, Lower Manhattan, we had 3 do it within a few hours of each other. Quite a coincidence. Building 7, remember, was not hit by a plane, didn't have any jet fuel in it, and consequently didn't have many fires in it. Somehow some fires got started, but if you look at the videos and the photographs from that day, you see fires on 3 floors of this 47-story building. And yet at 5:30 that afternoon, perfectly stable building with a few fires in it, straight down, collapses in 7 seconds. The only way buildings have ever been caused to collapse like that is through the use of explosives. You put explosives throughout the building, you've got to slice those steel columns. They've got to break so the building will fall. They all have to be sliced simultaneously if you want the building to come straight down. That's the kind of controlled demolition called implosion. Building 7 was a classic form of implosion. It starts at the bottom, the walls cave in, and it falls into a little pile of rubble. Whereas the towers, the story had to be that they collapsed because the planes hit them. So the collapse had to begin at the top, or look like it started at the top. So you have these explosions and things happening at the top, but nevertheless, once all that's over, the building comes straight down. It's implosion. It was very important the buildings come straight down. Think if the easiest way to bring down a building in controlled demolition is just make it fall over. You just have to do something to the base and the whole building falls over. But a 110-story building in Lower Manhattan would have destroyed so much of Lower Manhattan, people would have been really upset and maybe have demanded a real investigation of why those buildings came down. So they had to come straight down and not make anybody very angry. In terms of people who have money, as opposed to the families of the victims. This is what we have. And so the natural assumption would be, if explosions are the only way buildings have ever come down this way, wouldn't that be the natural assumption here? And yet, we're put on the defensive for saying the buildings came down by explosions. They say, that's lunacy. That's idiotic. No, what's idiotic, what's lunacy, is to think that fire brought the buildings down. It's never happened before. It's never happened since. It cannot happen according to the laws of physics. So that's the outrageous conspiracy theory that the Muslims brought the buildings down by crashing airplanes into them. And then when you look at the characteristics of the collapses, you see they have at least 11 features that are features of implosions. And even if you thought somehow maybe that day, maybe these buildings could have collapsed, because these features can only be explained. Not one of them can be explained apart from explosives. Certainly, the idea that all 11 of them could be explained, that they just coincidentally happened to occur. So what do I mean? I mean, first, the sudden onset. Because if it were fire that would have weakened the steel would gradually begin to bend and sag. But no, you look at the videos, you see buildings are perfectly still. And then all of a sudden, something happens. Secondly, the straight down feature. And if you go on Google and look under implosionworld.com, you will find there are only a few companies in the world that are qualified to do a genuine implosion. It's a science, it's an art, and it takes a lot of practice. It takes even setting up a building. Marc Loiseau, the head of controlled demolition, has an interview in The New Scientist. And he explains in there that it takes him hours of studying a building to figure out exactly where the explosives must go. And so to think that fire could have just accidentally brought the building down the way he does with all those explosives. Again, outrageous conspiracy theory. In the towers, you had 47 core columns in the center of the building, and then 236 perimeter columns. So for a total of 283 columns. For the building to come down symmetrically, as they did, all of those columns had to fail simultaneously. Could anybody believe that fire scattered here and there in the building could have caused all of those columns to heat up simultaneously and just begin to collapse spontaneously? Again, completely outrageous, impossible theory. Thirdly, virtually free fall speed. Even the 9/11 Commission admitted that the South Tower collapsed in 10 seconds. Free fall speed through the air would have been about 9 seconds. So that means that the stuff that fell outside the building's profile was not falling any faster than the stuff inside. So all that enormous steel and concrete in the lower floors below where the planes hit, about 80 floors in one building, 90 floors in the other one, offering no resistance whatsoever to the top floors that started coming down. Again, that's only possible. The basic law of physics is one of the most basic laws, is the law of the conservation of momentum. So the momentum of those lower floors was stability. And so if these other floors came down, these floors had to offer resistance. That would have slowed it down. Even if you could believe the pancake theory or somehow that it would force them on down, each floor would offer resistance. Let's say that it took a half second each for those floors to be dislodged. There you would have had a 40-second, a 50-second collapse. We've got a 10-second collapse. Again, basic laws of physics are violated. The steel is sliced. When you see the ground zero, you see that the steel comes down in pieces, conveniently ready to be loaded onto trucks. And if you go on to controlled demolition, or at least you used to be able to, you can see this sign, this note. Our systems segment steel components into pieces matching the lifting capacity of the available equipment. Another feature, almost all the concrete in these buildings was pulverized into very tiny dust particles. Now, if you'd go up to a 110-story building and drop a piece of concrete down, it would shatter. You would end up with pieces of concrete maybe like this. You would not end up with dust particles small enough to be breathed into your lungs. And yet, that's what happened there. And this is not controversial. Colonel John O'Dowd of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers said, at the World Trade Center sites, It seemed like everything was pulverized. So the concrete, the computers, the carpets, the desks, the chairs, everything, you end up with steel and dust. Furthermore, horizontal ejections. You have pieces of aluminum ejected out 700 feet horizontally. You can see this on the videos. You can see these pieces. And then some of those pieces are pieces of steel, and some of them were ejected out. I have 500 feet. A news story just came out this last week saying pieces of steel were found 600 feet out. According to the official story, the only energy available was gravitational energy and fire energy. Gravitational energy is vertical energy. Where does this tremendous horizontal energy come to push out huge pieces of steel several hundred feet? You see, everything makes sense once you say there were explosions. All these phenomena are what you would expect. But if there were no explosions, you wouldn't expect any of these. Again, the official theory is an outrageous conspiracy theory. Furthermore, for many people, for Stephen Jones, the physicist at BYU, he takes this as the most decisive element, that there were pools of molten steel under all three buildings. This means that the steel did have to be melted. But even, members of NIST say there was no melting. The fire could not melt steel. And yet, Marc Loiseau, head of controlled demolition, Peter Tully, another member involved in the cleanup, many of the workers at the cleanup, many people who came through testified to seeing molten steel. 2 months after 9/11, it stayed hot a long time. Took tremendous heat, some source of tremendous energy to produce molten steel that would remain molten for a long time. Furthermore, one piece of steel, most of the steel was taken away. Biggest destruction of evidence in history. Generally at a crime scene, you can't pick up a matchbook or you'll be arrested, sent to prison. Destruction of evidence. And yet here, you had thousands of tons of steel that were loaded on trucks, taken away, shipped to Asia to be melted down so they could never be studied. Why is that important? Because if you study steel, you can see signs of explosions. Well, they did find a piece of steel. And the story in the New York Times says, engineers are baffled over the collapse of WT7, and steel members have been partly evaporated. To evaporate steel requires even higher temperatures, 2,860 degrees Celsius to evaporate steel. So there was some tremendous source of energy bringing down those buildings. Furthermore, there are dozens of testimonies by people on the scene that explosions were occurring. In my new book, Christian Faith and Truth Behind 9/11, I have a whole chapter on this called Explosive Testimony. Some of this was available early on, but some of it became available only in the summer of 2005. The New York Fire Department had recorded the oral histories of the firefighters and the emergency medical workers on that day, and they told their stories of what they experienced. But that was not released to the public. The New York Times and the families of the victims got together and filed a suit to force the city of New York to release those files. And the courts kept ruling in favor of the city until it got to the State of Appeals, the highest court in New York. They finally forced them to release them. The New York Times put them on a website so that you can read them. You can find the website in my book. New York Times never reported on any of the contents of them, but they did make them available so we can know. And so let me give you just a few examples. One fire captain said, "I hear an explosion and I look up. It is as if the building is being imploded from the top floor down, one after another, boom, boom, boom." Another firefighter, "It seemed like on television when they blow up these buildings. It seemed like it was going all the way around like a belt, all these explosions." And that is one of the features, what they call a radiation belt or an explosion belt. Stephen Gregory, Assistant Fire Commissioner, I saw a flash, flash, flash at the lower level of the building. You know, like when they demolish a building? Wall Street Journal reporter John Bussey, the Wall Street Journal building was just across the way. He said, I looked out my window and to see what seemed like perfectly synchronized explosions coming from each floor of the South Tower, one after another, from top to bottom, with a fraction of a second between. The floors blew to pieces. Well, the testimonies go, literally dozens of these things from various kinds of people. One guy in the basement even reports about a fire door, steel and concrete, 300 pounds, was wrinkled up like a piece of aluminum foil. So the evidence is overwhelming that the buildings were brought down by explosions. Well, then, of course, the question is, well, who put them in there? Could Al-Qaeda members have gotten in there? This would take literally hundreds of man-hours to do the wiring, plant the explosives. How would they get in there? Well, you might say, if you think it's an inside job, how would have insiders gotten in? Well, that becomes less mysterious when you know about Securicom, and which was in charge of security for the World Trade Center, and you know that one of its principals was a man named Marvin Bush, yes, the brother of President Bush, and that the CEO for the company was Wirt Walker III, the cousin of Marvin and George Bush. So we can have a reasonable hypothesis as to how homegrown terrorists might have got in there to plant explosives. Okay, so the official theory about the collapse of the buildings is disproved as strongly as any theory could possibly be. You've got, 10 or 11 different ways to have a scientific proof that the official theory is impossible. And then when you get to Building 7, it's all the clearer, because you can't claim it was NIST wants to say the towers came down because the planes knocked the fireproofing off the steel. Well, that's ridiculous too, because remember, fireproofing only lasts for about 2 hours. In these other buildings that burned for 18 hours, you would have had the fire exposed to the steel for 16 hours. Again, it didn't collapse. And yet they want to tell you, because in the South Tower, the steel was exposed to the direct fire for 56 minutes. That caused the building to come down. But that aside, Building 7 was not hit by a plane. So they cannot claim that his fireproofing was knocked off. So how do they explain the collapse of Building 7? They don't. They have not issued a report on the collapse of Building 7. Why not? Well, we haven't had time to get to it. We will get to it sometime in 2007. In other words, after the next elections. What did the 9/11 Commission report do about Building 7? FEMA had already come out with a report saying, well, we can imagine some scenario in which maybe it could have collapsed. This could have happened, and this could have happened, and that could have happened, and that could have led to that, and that could have. But honestly, they admitted, this scenario has a very low probability of occurrence. A zero probability is a very low probability of occurrence. So that's what the 9/11 Commission report had. They had FEMA's report, so they knew they couldn't explain the collapse of Building 7. So what did the 9/11 Commission do? They didn't mention it. They had a 571-page report, and they did not mention the fact that Building 7 collapsed, even though this would have been a historic event, the first time a steel frame high-rise building had ever collapsed from fire alone. This would cause insurance company to adjust their premiums all over the world. They'd say, oh, now we know fire can bring down a steel frame high-rise building. We've got to really raise up our premiums. They didn't even report it. So you see, that's why many people say Building 7 is really the Achilles heel of the official story, and that's why they don't want to talk about it. NIST will not now debate even its report on the towers. The same Ed Haas that I told you about, the FBI and Osama bin Laden, called up NIST, talked to Michael Newman, their spokesperson, and said, you know, we've got these physicists like Jones and Jim Hoffman and others who doubt your report. They've written criticisms of it. This is confusing the public. Why don't we have a debate, put it on television, and let those scientists confront the NIST scientists? And if your NIST scientists are confident of their report, they can surely debunk these criticisms. Newman said, no NIST scientist is going to participate in any public debate. Newman went on Ed Haas went on then and set up a debate. He had it on his website that he'd got 7 of us from the 9/11 Truth Movement to agree to come to South Carolina on a particular date and participate. And Haas then invited all the members of the 9/11 Commission. That includes not just the 10 commissioners, but a staff of 75 people. He invited any member of the Bush administration, any member of NIST, come and participate in this debate. Not one single person accepted the challenge. So that gives you some idea how confident they are of their report. Okay, we come to the 5th point. Al-Qaeda hijacker Hani Hanjour flew Flight 77 into the West Wing of the Pentagon. There are so many things wrong with this picture. Hani Hanjour could barely fly a tiny Cessna. Flight instructors wouldn't go up with him a second time. And yet he allegedly flew this Boeing 757 across America, and then at the end did this magnificent 270-degree downward spiral in order to come in and hit the West Wing at almost ground level between the 1st and 2nd floors without disturbing a bit of grass on the Pentagon's lawn. A magnificent pilot, although he couldn't fly a Cessna. Secondly, why would they hit the West Wing? These brilliant terrorists who could outfox our trillion-dollar defense system surely would have known it's the East Wing they wanted to hit. That's where Rumsfeld was. That's where all the top brass were. They were the guys they hate, not the people over in the West Wing. Furthermore, the West Wing had been renovated, so it caused less damage than a strike anywhere else would have. All they had to do was fly right into the roof. You know, the Pentagon is many, many acres. All they had to do is fly into the roof. Maybe even Hani Hanjour could have done that. But no, they go out of their way to fly into the West Wing. Furthermore, there are ample signs that it was not even a 757 that hit the Pentagon. So you've seen the pictures, many of you, of the hole. There is not the kind of damage that you would have if a giant airliner had hit the Pentagon. Furthermore, there's no sign of debris from a 757. You look at the photographs, not a sign of a tail, a fuselage, even these giant steel engines. No. What happened to them? They must have gone inside. But you can see, before the wall collapsed, there was not a hole big enough for the plane to go inside. But let's say it somehow folded its wings back and scrunched in there. Surely the people inside would have seen it. But no, you ask the fire chief, Ed Plower. He says, no, I didn't see any engines, no signs of a big airliner. So, we're famous in America for magic bullets, those of you who know about so here we got a magic airplane. Okay. I've got another book coming out. Peter Dale Scott and I have edited a book called 9/11 and American Empire, Intellectuals Speak Out. Again, trying to show this isn't just a bunch of crazies on the internet. And one of the intellectuals in there is Karen Kwiatkowski, who since has gotten her PhD, but at the time was a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force and working in the Pentagon. And she came out that morning and, of course, looked and saw, and she says, no sign of debris, no sign of damage. that would fit with the Pentagon having been hit. So we have photographic evidence, we have eyewitness testimony. Pentagon was not hit by Flight 77 under the control of Hani Hanjour. Okay, point number 6. Al-Qaeda was the only organization with the motive and means to carry out the operation. Well, we've already shown that only the US government and the Pentagon were the ones with the means to do it. But what about motive? The motive of Al-Qaeda, they hated America and hated our freedoms. What a powerful motive, eh? Was there some other organization that might have had an equally strong motive or a stronger motive? Well, when the Soviet Union imploded in 1991, there were a group of neocons, neoconservatives, who started saying, you know, we've been living with this bipolar world for a long time. Now we're a unipolar world. There's only one superpower, and we like this. Let's keep it this way. And so they put out and said, our goal now is to prevent any other challenger on the planet from being able to rising up so they could challenge us militarily. And incidentally, who might those other challengers be? There are only 2 possibilities on the planet: China and future United States of Europe. So you should really pay attention to these motives. This came out in 1992. Dick Cheney, the outgoing Secretary of Defense, had Paul Wolfowitz and Scooter Libby write this document called Defense Planning Guidance. And this has been called a blueprint for permanent American global hegemony. Another author called it Cheney's Plan to Rule the World. What were the requirements for this? And what they're talking about is a Pax Americana. They use this language. You would need control of the world's oil, because as long as we're on an oil economy, whoever controls the oil controls the world. If America can get control of 80-90% of the world's oil, we can make Japan stay in line, we can take China and the rest of Asia stay in line, and we can make Europe stay in line if Europe decides, well, maybe we're not so hot about NATO. They also, so there were plans already from 1991. They wanted to go into Iraq and take out Saddam and take control of that country. In Afghanistan, a lot of oil there, around the Caspian Sea, and clearly there were plans to attack Afghanistan by July of 2001. So we didn't just respond to 9/11. That attack was already in the books. Secondly, they wanted a new doctrine of preemption, in which we would say, now because the world's so dangerous, our enemies are so many, we can no longer wait until there's an imminent threat. We will need to attack other countries before they get to the point where they are a threat. And sure enough, 9/11 gave the Bush administration the ability to do this, and that in fact is called the Bush Doctrine. That is what he will go down in history for, this new doctrine of preemptive, preventive warfare. Thirdly, they wanted a huge increase in military spending, hundreds of billions of dollars, although we were spending already more than the rest of the world put together for military matters. They said we need to spend still more. Fourthly, part of this money was to go for a technological transformation of the military, which would mean mainly computerizing everything and putting weapons in space, including nuclear weapons. This is in the books already. And the estimate is this would cost a startup cost of about $1 trillion. Finally, they said to get the American people ready to do this, said this transformation of the military will probably go very slowly, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor. And of course, immediately when 9/11 happened, it was compared to Pearl Harbor. After 9/11, Rumsfeld and Bush and Rice were all referring to 9/11 as a great opportunity to refashion the world. So we had a motive far more powerful than any motive than Al-Qaeda had. Seventh, the official story can be believed because it has been verified by the 9/11 Commission, which was a fully independent, impartial commission. There are so many things to say about it, but the main thing is to say commission was run by Philip Zelikow, who was essentially a member of the Bush administration. He had been with Condoleezza Rice in the first Papa Bush's administration. Then when the Democrats were in power during the Clinton years, Rice and Zelikow wrote a book together. Then when she was named National Security Advisor for the new Bush administration, she brought on him to help with the transition. Then he's appointed to the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. And then finally, and most significantly, when she had the job of writing National Security Strategy of the United States of America, 2002, Richard Haass in the State Department wrote the first version, and she says, not bold enough. So she brings on her old friend Philip Zelikow to write the new document, and that's where this doctrine of preemptive preventive warfare was first made the official doctrine of the United States of America. So the very guy who writes this document using 9/11 as the pretext is then brought on to head up the 9/11 Commission to see if maybe the Bush administration might have been partly responsible for 9/11. It's just outrageous. It's beyond belief. You couldn't make this stuff up in a movie and say, nobody would think that was plausible. But that's how ridiculous things have been. And the press doesn't report this. Okay. I've got so much more to say about Zelikow that I won't. Thierry Masson, the French writer who first raised questions about the Pentagon, is just now editing a volume, and I do have a chapter in there that will be called Philip Zelikow, the 9/11 Commission Report, Philip Zelikow's masterpiece of omission and distortion, and you can find out even more about him. Okay, so my point about the truth is, the truth about 9/11 is that the official story is not true. And once you see the way it's not true, you see that it is most plausible, the only plausible explanation is that it was an inside job. Now, I've come to the question, should this truth be revealed? Of course, the 9/11 Truth Movement has operated on the assumption of course it could. It should be revealed. And most people probably think this. But elite members of our society, those financial and corporate leaders and political military leaders, owners of the mass media, might think otherwise. They may fear that exposing the truth about 9/11 would lead, I'll read this last part so I can get it just right, might lead to a crisis of confidence that would lead to consequences worse than letting the perpetrators of 9/11 get away with it. The global economy is already in a very precarious state, they may argue, and a crisis of confidence in the institutions of the world's most powerful nation could lead to a global meltdown. There is no doubt, I would say, that a global economic collapse would be a real possibility and that it would have severe consequences that could well last for many years. So yes, having the truth about 9/11 revealed so that it would become part of the worldwide public discourse might indeed have dire consequences. There is only one thing that would be worse: continuing to have the truth about 9/11 concealed. Why so? Okay. Why so? We are facing the likelihood of a global collapse that will be far worse than an economic collapse. I refer to an ecological collapse, which is very likely to occur within the present century unless our policies are changed drastically and quickly. The ecological collapse could be brought on quickly through a nuclear winter, caused by even a small exchange of nuclear weapons, or more slowly, through runaway global warming. The United States government has been the major impediment to a solution to both of these problems. Since 9/11, the United States government has become even more dangerous, ridiculing global warming while practicing an extreme version of double standards in relation to nuclear technology. allowing all of our friends to have nuclear weapons, while denying to enemies even the right to develop nuclear energy for peaceful purposes, while at the same time strengthening our own nuclear arsenal and even planning to put nuclear weapons in space. Apart from a revelation of the truth about 9/11, there is little chance that the present trajectory of U.S. policy, with its threat to the survival of civilization itself, will change. Even a change of administrations will probably result in only minor changes, apart from a revelation of the truth about 9/11. Because the present mythology about 9/11 will be used to justify continuing to focus entirely on human relationships rather than on the overarching issue of our time, which is the relation of human civilization as a whole to the ecosphere in which we live and on which we are entirely dependent. Although I and other members of the 9/11 Truth Movement in the United States continue to hope that our Congress and our mass media will finally expose the truth about 9/11, there is realistically little chance of that happening. So I am here to call on Europeans to find a way to discover for yourselves and then expose the truth about 9/11, perhaps through the creation of a jury, a citizens' jury of highly respected members of the European community who could listen to testimony from the 9/11 Truth Movement and then hear rebuttals from anyone in the Bush administration or from the 9/11 Commission report, 9/11 Commission, or from NIST or any other official organization, and then render a judgment to the world. So this is my challenge to you and why I came to Europe. Thank you very much.